So this particular video is going to cover a little bit more about social psychological methods of research. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the types of research we find in social psychology, the tools that social psychologists use to do their research, and some things that might be a little bit more unique to social psychology research. So we explored a little bit more about what social psychologists studied in the previous video, and here's a little bit more about how they study it. So as per the definition that Allport established, social psychology uses the scientific method. So social psychologists manipulate and measure variables, they assign people to experimental and control groups, they attempt to establish causation and eliminate alternative causes. So they attempt to do scientific research using the scientific method and inquiry, which makes it a science. In terms of the sorts of tools that are at a social psychologist's disposal, surveys are fairly standard. Sometimes we might observe people's behavior directly or indirectly. So for example, Bob Cialdini, who's one of my favorite social psychologists, you'll hear a little bit more about him later this semester. He'll take a look at littering behavior and how signage can have an impact on littering behavior, which is obviously an indirect observation because he just takes a look at how much litter is around based on what sort of signage is up. You might look at how quickly people react to certain stimuli. That's the basis of the implicit attitudes task. So we're going to take a look at the IAT later this semester and learn a little bit more about it. When we talk about social neuroscience, we'll also take a look at which areas of the brain tend to activate under certain circumstances, like for example, when we're rejected. We can also measure things like hormone levels to see how people react to threat in terms of spikes of testosterone. So there are all sorts of methods, biological and using the standard sort of tools of the trade in terms of surveys that are at the disposal of social psychologists. When I studied, for example, at University of Kentucky, I was trained on how to do fMRI research. So that was within my wheelhouse as a researcher when I was in graduate school. As we talked about before, social psychology is different than sociology for a few different reasons. The first is, of course, the focus on individuals in social psychology, as opposed to the focus on groups or communities in sociology. In addition, social psychology is more focused on research in a specific sort of experimental way. So, for example, sociology tends to measure an awful lot and observe an awful lot, but social psychology is a lot more focused on manipulation of the environment to see how that leads to changes. So you're a lot more likely to see research in social psychology that involves random assignment, where there's different groups and they experience different outcomes, and you look to see how that changes how people might react. Whereas sociology tends to take a look at something as it is and just study it in a lot of great detail and take a look at patterns. So social psychology is more focused on empirical research that involves, once again, that manipulation, whereas sociology is more observational. Another thing I wanted to distinguish is basic and applied psychology. We talked a little bit about applied psychology when I talked about Kurt Lewin in the video about the history of psychology. So we think about basic and applied psychology as studying principles or theories of behavior versus practical applications of those theories. So for example, a basic psychology question would be, what are some of the underlying principles of persuasion? Whereas applied psychology would be about using those principles in order to increase recycling behaviors. This is what I'm asking you to do if your group decides to do a community intervention or create a PSA, to apply principles of conformity and persuasion in order to get people to engage in a positive behavior or to stop doing a negative behavior. Another example of applied psychology would be encouraging people to vote. And once again, I would say that of the different fields of psychology, social psychology is one that tends to have its feet fairly firmly in both areas of psychology. So there tends to be a lot more applied psychological research going on in the field of social psychology than there are in other more experimental areas. Other areas like industrial organizational psychology, for example, tend to be much more applied, but I would say that social psychology is the field that kind of splits the difference between the two. This is another example of applied psychology, how you might apply persuasion to different things. Marketing research, for example, is a whole lot of applied social psychology. They steal from us all the time. Here's some other terms that I want you to be familiar with. The concept of experimental versus quasi-experimental versus non-experimental, and independent versus dependent variable. So when I say experimental, I mean a study is pure in terms of random assignment, where it has an independent variable where groups have been randomly assigned and where all of the variables are controlled. With a quasi-experimental design, that reflects the fact that sometimes you might have a variable that you cannot randomly assign. So for example, sometimes I'm interested in studying gender differences when I do jealousy research. And I can't randomly assign someone's gender. They tend to have fairly firm opinions about that. Likewise, sometimes I'm interested in the role that personality can play in someone's behavior. And you can't randomly assign someone to be extroverted or introverted. They tend to come to the table with their personality already set. You just kind of have to measure it. You can't randomly assign it. So there are various variables that psychologists study that sometimes cannot be randomly assigned because of ethics or just because of practicality. But if you have a study that's set up with independent and dependent variables where you're looking at causal relationships, but you don't have pure random assignment for all of your variables, that would be called quasi-experimental. And then there are studies that are non-experimental. These studies tend to not necessarily have different groups. They tend to be mostly observational. They don't necessarily have any sort of manipulation of the environment. So some observational studies would be qualified as non-experimental. Survey studies are also examples of non-experimental research where there might not be different groups that are exposed to different stimuli. It's just a whole bunch of people filling out surveys and then you take a look at their patterns. If you're just doing correlation, you don't necessarily establish a causal relationship. So that would be non-experimental. When it comes to independent and dependent variables are the variables you manipulate or measure at the start of the experiment that you propose as the cause for an outcome. And dependent variables are the effect or the outcome itself. So for example, if I was taking a look at different plant fertilizers to see how they impacted plant growth, the different fertilizers would be my independent variable and the plant growth would be my dependent variable. Random assignment is the basic concept where if you have a pool of people that you're using for your participants, you randomly assign them to the experimental or control condition. This is different than random selection, where you select participants from a pool of a population. Random assignment is when you already have your pool for your sample already set, and you're simply sorting them into which groups they're going to be in, the experimental or control condition. The reason we engage in random assignment is so that we can be sure that the two groups are equivalent to one another at the start of the experiment, and that any individual differences are spread out roughly evenly between the groups, so that any differences we see at the end of the experiment is due to our manipulations and not due to any other fluctuations across the groups. Here's just some of the settings we might see in social psychology research. So naturalistic observation is where people go out into public spaces and observe without interfering, and sometimes that observation is while being hidden so that people aren't aware that they're being observed. So with naturalistic observation, the goal here is to see whether a certain phenomena is observable in the wild, in public, spontaneously without having to be created in a lab. So there's a great deal of validity in establishing that a certain behavior exists in the real world naturally and without any interference on your part. It lends a greater validity to a theory to be able to observe it in the real world. Naturalistic observation is known as participant-driven data, where the participant's behavior is the thing that drives what happens, and you don't necessarily manipulate the environment in any way or interfere. You're just there to take a look at what it is that they're doing. And as a result, naturalistic observation can sometimes be messy and lacking in control. So this just means that you have very little, if any, capacity to make any sort of causal argument with naturalistic observation. You're just taking a look at what's happening. You're not manipulating things or controlling the environment and what it's like to make sure it's consistent. You're just taking a look at what's happening and writing it down in a lot of detail and trying to see patterns and come to conclusions. when you want to establish causation, you have to do research in a laboratory setting with greater control. Participant observation is sometimes something else that we see. So with participant observation, that's when the person embeds themselves within an environment and pretends to be a fellow participant. So they pose as one of the people in the environment and do not disclose that they are an experimenter. So for example, someone who wanted to get an inside view into hazing might pose as someone rushing in a fraternity or sorority. Now, this has some ethical challenges, as does naturalistic observation, because when you're embedding yourself in a group and posing as a fellow group member without disclosing that you're an experimenter, sometimes that's it's a violation of trust to do that. It does offer slightly more control. It is harder to be objective when you are embedded in the middle of something, which can sometimes happen. The Stanford Prison Experiment would be a classic example of that if you want to look up more about it. And then, of course, a laboratory setting would be where the researcher is working to create an environment that has the greatest degree of control possible. So they work to eliminate extraneous variables and alternative causes so that participants have a consistent experience and only have one difference in terms of what is varied. The laboratory setting offers the greatest degree of control out of all of these settings. Here's some considerations we occasionally see cropping up when it comes to social psychology research that might not necessarily be as featured in other areas of psychology. So observer effects are very simply the fact that participants will change their behavior if they are aware they're being observed. Sometimes this can lead to interesting phenomena that as a researcher you want to avoid, where participants become overly self-conscious or they are attempting to discover the purpose of the study and so are a little bit more hyper-aware about how they're reacting to various stimuli in the study. Response bias is a very simple psychological process where people don't necessarily always tell the truth when they answer questions about how they think and feel about things. It's just something that can happen sometimes, and sometimes it can happen more often than others, depending on what you're studying. So one of the things I study, as I mentioned earlier, is Schadenfreude, which is pleasure at the misfortune of others. And you can imagine that's a little bit challenging to get people to admit to. One of the things that sometimes becomes important to consider is what we call experimental realism. So experimental realism is where participants are fully engaged and involved in the study. They are reacting as if they would realistically, and they are fully involved in what's going on. So the experiment has had an impact of some kind on their thoughts, feelings, and behavior. They aren't phoning it in. So when an experiment engages someone, that's known as experimental realism. So for example, in my jealousy research, I was really pleased to see that my manipulation of jealousy by having participants read a chat log really had an impact on their aggressive choices later. That indicated to me that the study had a great deal of experimental realism. Mundane realism is the concept of whether something is similar to the outside world. So, for example, something like the Milgram shock experiment, where participants were brought into the study and asked to give a confederate a series of increasing shocks. That is not necessarily something we might encounter on a daily basis. That is kind of outside of the realm of a realistic everyday sort of experience. But it was very high in experimental realism. The participants in the study took it very seriously. They thought it was real, and they thought that they were actually giving someone shocks. The experiment had a very high degree of experimental realism. It had a very deep impact on the participants in the study, while it might not have necessarily been high in mundane realism. So in mundane realism, you try to set up something that's as similar to the outside world as possible, and the participant may not necessarily even realize what it is you're actually taking a look at. So for example, you could tell them that you're studying how people work in groups when you're really studying cheating behavior, but the setup that you have is very similar to what you might see in a workplace. So not all studies require high degrees of mundane realism, but hopefully your participants have a high degree of experimental realism, that they are engaging in what's going on in the study and taking things at face value. When it comes to enhancing realism, there are a few different things that I engage in as a researcher and that other people engage in as well in social psychology. So the first is the use of confederates. Confederates are people who are trained to react to circumstances in a specific way, so that we have a little bit more degree of control over the environment. Once again, disguised participant observation is where the experimenter is embedded within a group of people and is posing as a fellow participant. Sometimes disguising a purpose of a study can serve to distract participants from what it is you're actually taking a look at, making them less self-conscious about that particular component of their behavior. So that if you're concerned that participants would change their behavior, if they were aware that you were studying something, you might tell them it's about something else and disguise the true purpose of the study to reduce those that self-consciousness that they might have. When we disguise the true purpose of a study, that's known as a deception study. And deception studies are something we see much more likely in social psychology than in other areas of psychology because, once again, of those observer effects and the fact that people can have a great deal of expectations and can be very self-aware of their behavior. So, for example, if I were to tell someone that I was studying how they reacted when they were embarrassed, knowing that I was studying that would change how their experience of embarrassment would go. I actually did a study like this with a student researcher where she was really interested in studying embarrassment. What we ended up doing is we were saying that we were interested in taking a look at how people respond to the sound of their own voice versus the sound of a stranger's voice, and then had them record themselves singing a nursery rhyme and then made them listen to it. And that's how we induced embarrassment. And we didn't tell them what we were actually studying so that they wouldn't necessarily be thinking, oh, they're studying my embarrassment right now. Because if we had, they would have fundamentally changed. It would have been a very different sort of experience for them. And it would have been much more complicated than simply studying embarrassment. The reason why we use deception studies is because when we ask someone hypothetically what they would do in a certain scenario, they respond with a hypothetical response. So there's a difference between saying, would you be jealous in this scenario, versus having someone believe that they're in the scenario and asking them how they feel. Deception has significant ethical concerns. So deception is not done lightly. We tend to only engage in deception when it is absolutely necessary and there's no other way to study the phenomenon in question. One of the reasons why we do this is because whenever a participant is deceived, it's a violation of trust. And it's very important to know that that could potentially undermine the field of science or perceptions of psychology in general, perceptions of psychologists as untrustworthy. So it's very important to be sparing with the use of deception and to really only use it when it's very important for the phenomenon that you're studying. Another distinct ethical concern is the lack of true informed consent because participants are not informed about the true purpose of the study. This is often made up for after the fact by extensive debriefing and requesting participants provide you with permission to use their data. So something that they could potentially withdraw after the fact, even if they could not give full, true informed consent at the start. Some institutions go so far as to make you as a researcher sign a waiver of informed consent because deception informed consent is not true informed consent. And once again, we've already talked a little bit about the violation of trust thing. So it's important when thinking through running a deception study to engage in a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether the question is worthy and whether it's worth the potential risk of deception. It's also worthwhile to identify alternative potential ways you can study the question other than using deception. Once again, debriefing is an important part of deception research when it is done. So participants have a very lengthy exposure to the true purpose of the study at the end, and they're told everything about the hypotheses of the study and what was the point of deception and why they were deceived. And they also, of course, sign that permission to use data. But I would say that it's important to be respectful of participants and to not squander that trust and to respect their dignity and autonomy. So the permission to use data is one of the ways that we respect participants' dignity, but to also make sure that that when we engage in deception research, to do so in a way that maintains a participant's dignity. And once again, as scientists, we have a higher moral responsibility to make sure that we are not undermining trust in science or psychology. So that's also something that must be weighed when making a decision about whether to do deception research.